Okay, in this video, I'm going to go over how to create this wood handle material. I was using this as my primary reference, but I was also looking at some other references for some wood detail. So I'm just going to walk through my slides and show you, or my layers, and show you guys how I made this material. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead and disable all of my layers down to the very first one. So we'll just go down here. Just clicking and dragging on these eye icons, get rid of them. And here we go. So it's built up over a lot of different little pieces. So the first thing I started with is a material that's in here called wood grain. So it should probably be somewhere close to the bottom. Wood plane. Okay, sorry, wood plane. So I added that one in. The thing I was noticing on this one is the major grain shapes are really large. So I played around a lot with the projection. So I did a planar projection. So I'm going to just duplicate this so we can goof around with this without messing it up too much. So we'll just let it wait a second. Hide the other original one. Okay. And so in here, default's going to be UV projection. And then if I do a preset, let's just do a preset. It's going to be something kind of like this. So the first thing I did was I did a custom color. So we just used a custom wood color, and I was letting me go ahead and color sample from this image. I had to get a little darker. And one thing I probably should check is, let's make sure I don't have my adjustments on. So I was just kind of eyeballing it, trying to figure out, see, that's like a brown color. This is a brown color. I'm noticing there's a lot more red in this, so I'm just pushing a little bit more red, and I might make it just slightly more saturated. Okay. Um, and then this has obviously plenty of settings. If you're going in and you are messing around with a preset material, one thing I recommend doing is coming in here, and this one doesn't have height, but if it did have height, you might want to play around with this. So height range. So some of these materials, when you bring them in by default, they have like height information. And so you can see, since I have displacement on, is really, really crunching it. Oh, this one doesn't, this one's probably, no, this one should have height information. So it does have height information. I just don't know why I can't change it. But I would make an adjustment to that because it's going to have all that setting. So I know on this one has normal map information. So I actually turned off the normal map information, but if you turn it on, you can see it there. So I just didn't really care for the normal map information. It was giving me some weird errors, so I just turned it off. So yeah, the only other thing I did was I just played with this grain size. Like I said, these are really large, so I would play around with the tiling. So if I do less tiling, then it's going to be bigger. I might want to stretch it so you can tile it in a particular direction, which is pretty handy. So you can do that. Another thing you can do is this is currently UV projection. So if I wanted to use a manipulator, I can go UD or 3D, or sorry, 3D, 2D, and then I can just rotate if I wanted to and move it that way. And you can scrunch it and place it. So sometimes that's a lot easier. I was doing a planar projection, so and this one uses a 3D space. If you're using UV, you can come over to the 2D view to manipulate it. Everything else is going to be in the 3D view. So we'll come out here. And so just was rotating and playing with this to get the grain size that I wanted, and I felt matched the look. So we'll just go ahead and get this somewhere in place. Something good enough is really what we're aiming for. If you press Q or click on this, then you can turn on and off the manipulator. It automatically hides when you select a layer that doesn't have that. But let's see. The other thing I might want to play around with is the shapes of the wood grain. So you can see veins density. That's going to be how many veins there are. So this is just going to be how frequent or how large they are. So I kind of just played with this a lot just to get the shape I liked, really, more than anything. So each of these settings kind of gave me an idea of what I was going to go for, but by being able to play around with this, I was able to just get it to the shape, distinct shape and character I like. Alternatively, what I could do is I could make this so it doesn't have any grains. So if I set this to vein density 0, and then I just did a fill layer and then use something like, let's see, natural. So I have these scan data image sets that I could use. So I could use something like this right here. where I could drop it in as, let's do it as mask. And then let's set this one to just color, just multiply. So base color multiply. Maybe a little roughness. So we'll make it maybe a little rougher. And then we'll come into this. I want to set the projection to cylindrical, rotate it 90 degrees. There we go. And then I can play around with, since this is a cylindrical projection, I can come in here and I can actually scale and move it. The cylindrical is a little weirder, but what I'm going to do is just kind of shrink it down a little bit. This one's not tileable, so you can see when it starts tiling is an issue. So we could manipulate and play with something like this, and I would then do something like a high pass filter. So add filter high pass maybe, depends on the image and what you're trying to manipulate, and then add levels. Okay. And then let's invert that. So, and then I would just play around with this to get the grain shape I want. So, but we're not going to do that. I already have one that has the grain in it, so I'm just going to work with that. So I just manipulated that into a shape I liked. All right, the next thing I did was I added in some additional fibers, because there's like a lot of this like kind of like vertical stripiness going into it. So it kind of comes in and out. You can see it a little bit on this one a little bit better. So I just added this layer right here, which is just reintroducing the grain. So in this one, all I really did was I took this messy fibers material, or tileable material. So this is in here. So I just use messy fibers for my first one. And then you can see linear dodge is just adding. So I added these like more vertical stripe ones. And I just played around with, you can see I was playing around with the balance and contrast to get the shapes I want, right? And get the contrast I need, right? So something like that. To give me some of those longer vertical ones, I like to have variation in size and scale. So I don't want just one or either of these. I added a little breakup. So just using a clouds, if I set it to normal, you'll see it looks like this. If I set it to subtract or multiply, it doesn't really matter in this case. It's just going to randomly kind of like darken these. So it's a little less regular across. So there's some areas where I lose it, some areas I see it. So we get some nice lost and found. All right. And then I just layered on another directional. This one's a different map, directional scratches. So these are all maps that are in here. I just played around with each of those. So I have directional noise, messy fiber, directional scratches. They all have aspects that I like in them. Some of them have like the directional scratches have a lot of extra settings that makes it pretty nice for getting custom shapes, right? So if I can make these thicker or thinner, or longer or shorter. So this one's pretty cool. And yeah, so it's a lot about layering these on together. So that gave me that. So I just have a color that's multiplied, so it's a little bit darker, made it rougher in those fibers. If I turn off roughness, you can kind of see it disappears a bit. And then a little bit of negative height. Okay, so that's like my base wood material. The one thing I did add to this wood plane, let's come back to it really quickly, is I did do a roughness adjustment because I felt like my grain was a little too high contrast in the roughness. So we look at the roughness, it looks like right there, and then I just did that. And so I just added a levels node to this, this material. And on the levels node, I just brought in the output min and max, which just reduces the contrast. And then the only other thing is I'm going to use this layer later on, the pattern that I have right here, that this pattern right here. So I'm going to use that later on for some of my other layers. So I just added an anchor point. So we have this anchor point so we can reference this layer later and use the pattern in some other layer. All right, let's move on to some of the color breakup. So these are just several layers of color breakup. I'm mostly just looking at colors I'm noticing inside the material. So I'm seeing like these orange reds right around here. If you look at this compared to like right here, this is like a paler yellow. There's almost like a green tone in some areas. Sometimes I'll add like a little bit of blue. It really depends on what I'm seeing and if the overall effect is kind of feeling close to my reference. So this first one, I just added some color. I set to highlight. I play around with the blend modes as well. So highlight's going to do a color mixing mode. This is what it looks like with normal. So it's like that. So highlight is going to blend with it. Let's come in and look at this map. It's a pretty simple map. For these ones, this one I was just using Grunge Map 15 because it has like a wood green pattern to it. And then that cylindrical projection, because it's a cylindrical object, makes it so it maps really nicely to the handle and kind of has like a directionality to it. So yeah, I just did that one, and then I'll just kind of turn these all on so we can see the effects of these added up, right? So these are my main color breakup layers that I was just adding to get some variation to the wood color. So without it, with it. So look at the base color, without it, and with it. So not a lot of changes. We'll go ahead and make another one in a second. So let's take a look at the rest of these though first. So this one's just kind of a similar idea, highlight. I dialed down the value. I just took that same map and all I really did was, it's the same mask as this one, but the main difference, I didn't even move it. All I really did was I just clicked on the seed button. So the cool thing is with certain tilables in here, when you click on the seed button, it'll just randomize the placement of it. So you can get kind of almost like a new map in a lot of ways. And so this is the same thing. Oh, actually this one's grunge map. Oh, it says 005, but it's still 15. I don't know why it says 005. But this is the same one. I was playing C with C just to be like, oh, I like that mark here. So that looks great. So, you could play around with it. So I liked this one because it had, and I also liked the highlight feature because if I just did screen, that's too bright. But on some of those, they like blend and mix with the colors really nicely. So yeah, both of these are just colors. Just did a lighter color. And I really liked that feature. And I was just playing around color, right? You come in here and you kind of play around with it. The cool thing about this highlight is, I could do like a burnishing effect too. So it has some nice features to it. So anyways, I had something like that. We'll Control Z that back before I moved it. And then I had this green one. And on this green one, it just looks like this. So I had something like this. This one's Grunge Map 015 again, but it was just green everywhere, right? It's like making my whole thing green. So I just added a clouds set to multiply just to kind of let it be lost and found, right? So that it's not everywhere. And then if I was to make some updates, what I would do is let's go ahead and add like a bigger color breakup one. So we're going to add duplicate layer. This one's going to be a little bit stronger. So I'm going to come in here. We're going to choose something that's more on the orange-red side. We're going to go for something like darker. And let's go ahead and set this to highlight because I think highlight was, or hard light. You think it's highlight, but hard light had some interesting things to it. Let's see. And I'm just going to get rid of that one so we can see it a little bit better. Here we go. Let's turn that opacity up a bit more. And there we go. Maybe we'll just make it not quite so dark. There we go. And then we'll just come in here and then I can play with seed on this right here. So click on seed. Kind of get something I like. If it feels like it's overwhelmingly showing this layer and it's only some areas where it's not showing it, usually means that it's more white than black. So one thing I could do is I can just always invert that. So something like that. So let's go ahead and click on seed. All right, and then we can maybe add that clouds back in. Same thing with the clouds, I can seed that to kind of control it, maybe play with the balance to control how much of it's showing, how much of it's not working. And so right now it's set to multiply, so that's why it's subtracting. And I might play with the tiling just a bit. Cool. That's pretty much exactly what I did for those layers. All right, so that's just some color breakup going. And just click on the material icon to collapse the mask because sometimes those take up a lot of space. All right, next I'm going to go over some more of my characteristic marks that I'm seeing. All right, the first one I wanted to identify was these dark marks. There's these like kind of dark red stain splotches. So there's like one here, one here, one here, and a little bit of everywhere. I can see it's like kind of like a maroon red, but then it also gets so dark that it's almost black. So this is what I did next. So I did these big splotchy shapes. And I could do like more characteristic marks and paint them if I wanted to, but all I really did on this one, oops, wrong one. And you can see I did a lot of things. Let's go ahead and turn this down to the bottom. So this one I kind of layered up a lot. It probably requires a lot less than this, but I started with this pattern. Just come out here. I liked it because it had like some spot shapes. And then I just was subtracting from it. And in reality, it gets so low that, I mean, honestly, could probably get rid of it. But then what I did was I just started layering some of these layers together, or layering some additional layers on top. So what we did was, in this case, I took these levels and I just amped it up All I really needed to do though on that was probably just not have those, because that's kind of what those levels are doing. Well, the levels are, or the clouds are kind of masking things off. So anyways, you can use a map that's similar to this. So you can build it up a different way. This was just, I keep adding and subtracting things to get the look I want. So I got something kind of like this. I blurred a little bit to get it a little softer. I use blur slope to make it a little bit more organic. If we take a look at that, that's what it looks like with a blur slope. And the blur just softens the details a little bit. Added anchor point, because I'm going to reference this in this layer up here. And the only other thing I did was I used these directional scratches to subtract out. So it kind of has like a wood grain effect to it. It's very subtle. Oh, whoops, I'm not even doing the right one. There we go. So we got a little bit of wood grain effect to kind of reinforce that it's interacting with the wood. Okay, so that's just that. This is set to color multiply and a little bit of roughness change. So I'm just changing the roughness to be slightly glossier. So something like that. Okay. And then I noticed this was not having the punch and, dramatic effect that some of these. So I made a second layer that just kind of darkened some of those marks. Not everywhere, but in some places. So this layer right here, all it's really doing is it's grabbing this anchor point that I had set right here, this big color spots mask. Just set an anchor point down here by going right click, anchor point. And then on this one right here, I just loaded in that anchor point from here. I blurred it a little bit. I used levels to kind of clamp it down. So what you can do is if you use blur, you're kind of spreading the white and black values into each other, which is nice because then it lets you add a levels node, and you can either shrink it or you can grow it, so it can get bigger or get smaller. And then you can make it sharp again by just bringing the black and white points together, and then you get something that's really sharp and crispy. Only downside is, when you blur, you do lose a little bit of detail and form, so it's not always, this isn't foolproof. But anyways, that's kind of what I did here. So I just used the levels node to shrink it down, so it's only in like the core of the bigger shapes, and then just use blur slope to break it up and add some organic nature. I could use warp instead, but you can now see those darker marks showing up. Cool. All right. So now that I have those, I moved on to, I was just getting some more of those red splotches. So there's like little tiny bits and pieces. So I just added this in to add a little bit more of the darker stains. I just called it red splotches. I don't need height, probably shouldn't do height, but I added a little roughness to it. For my roughness channels, a lot of times I'm trying to integrate or mix together with the layers below. So I almost always set it to like overlay or multiplier screen if I'm doing roughness adjustments, so that it just mixes with the layers below instead of just covers. Because when it just covers, your textures start to get really flat. Okay, so that was just a little breakup. This one's pretty straightforward. I just have these different material or like different layers. Just did a little adjustment and then added some back in. So it just looks something like that. So if we come out here, you can probably get rid of this levels node. And let's see what happens if we get a little blur node. Yeah, let's get rid of the blur node. So it just looks like this. I just layered a couple using the screen or linear dodge add, whichever one you want to use. All right. Now what I did was I reinforced my veins. So what I did was I gave them a little bit of heights to them, and then I can control the roughness. The reason why I did this was, instead of in the layer or inside this material at the beginning, is now I have like a lot more control, because all the control for the grain is like baked into these settings, and it's affecting the rest of the model or material. And so for the veins, I'm just coming in here, and again, I'm using that anchor point. So I'm coming in here. I don't know, it's called natural 11. Don't worry about that. So I'm just grabbing the anchor point. So we just went to anchor point. We're using that base color because we could have used roughness too, probably. Let's see what roughness looks like. So it looks like that. But I just used base color. And then what I did was I just brought this in so I could see the shape. I wanted to target the grain, these wood grains. So I inverted it so that would be white. So now I have to play with the values a bit more. Let's see, let's go in here. Okay, let's pull this forward. Okay, this took a lot of playing around. There we go. All right, so I got something kind of like that. And then what I did was just blurred it a little bit so that it's not quite as sharp. And then I added clouds to add or remove it. So it's just like it was everywhere. It's the same deepness, right? And so by doing this, there's some areas where it's a little deeper, like over here it's less deep, and right here it's more deep. So that just gives it a more of an organic look to it. And this just has color, height, and roughness. So it just has a negative height, darker color set to multiply, and then roughness I set to screen. So if I screen my roughness, it's going to brighten my roughness, which means my roughness gets higher. So it's more rough. So here. So the veins are now like lightening that area. Okay. I noticed there's a lot more grain kind of texture to it, and that line was missing. So I added some additional like kind of grain directionality and noise. So for this one, oops, wrong one. We'll come to this. Let's see what I did for this one. So what I did first was I started with directional scratches. So this is one of the ones in here. So directional scratches. Directional scratches. So that's the one that has all those controls on it. So we just added it in. I did a cylindrical projection, rotated this 90 degrees. Okay. Actually, I might have done UV projection. So sometimes with different projections, like when you do the 3D projections, you might notice like some filtering issues. So it gets like maybe a little noisy. So let's try it, see if we can see that with cylindrical projection. And then if I like start tiling things, sometimes it gets like a little noisy or it gets like some errors. Some of that's just a projection, right? If I move this, it's going to definitely change that. But if it gets kind of like alias and noisy, one thing you can try is you can try changing the filtering method. In this case, that's not the issue. So in this case, I think I probably should just use UV projection because the UVs are laid out pretty flat. The only difference is there's probably a seam somewhere here. This is such a noisy texture, you probably can't see the seam, so that's probably good. But that would be the downside of using a UV projection. Okay. And then in here, like I said, we can play with the pattern size, right? So I'm just gonna make them thinner. I can make them longer, shorter, density. I could do a little randomization of angle, but you want to be careful because eventually it'll start to feel like mesh fiber, kind of like a carpet or something like that. But anyways, that's what I did for this one. And then I used levels to crunch it down. And this was when I did the levels, I was noticing some weird texturing. So you can see that the texture changes a lot depending on which of these filtering methods I use. So I wouldn't worry too much about what's appropriate, what's right, and worry more about like when you adjust it, if it looks better or looks like what you want. And then of course, a little lost and found. We'll come out and see what this looks like so far. So here's this kind of wood grain texture, little lost and found going in. Come back in here. Here's directional scratches again. So I'm adding some more on. I added a little warp to it. So you can see there's a little wobble. So I just added a warp filter with a low intensity and a big source parameter. Use levels to adjust it. And when I'm doing a levels adjustment, I'm usually doing it out here to see, what I like about it. So a lot of those adjustments, I'll add those in. I'll look at this mask by pressing Alt and click on it, add the mask, make sure I'm getting the right settings and it's doing it the right thing. And then I'll pop back out and then I'll just like turn it on and off or like tweak the settings a little bit and just see if I'm getting the results I want. Okay. We have another levels adjustments, peeling. So what I did on this one is let's see. Okay. I know what I did. I just added in one of these texture maps I have. So I have this peeling paints texture map that I got from a pack on ArtStation. So we just grabbed one of these, threw it in there, and set it to multiply or subtract. I guess it doesn't really matter. So this is what it normally looks like. So where the white parts are, if I do subtract, it's going to get rid of that. Or if I do multiply, it's going to use the black marks instead. So that was just to add some more variation, have it lost and found, and then I just use the sharpen to sharpen the details, which might be necessary, might not be necessary. Not super important, but yeah. So that's how I got those smaller veins, just to kind of add a little bit more texture to this. Cool, let's keep moving on. Let's see. I did some bottom lightning, so this is a very, very subtle, small effect, but on this one, what I did was I just did a linear gradient, 3D linear gradient. To find that, you just go up here and type 3D linear. And I don't actually know, it's not in any of these. So it's not actually in one of these categories. So, but what you do is just bring it over, drag it over like this. It'll by default look something like this, where it goes from top to bottom. if you've baked your, let's press B on my keyboard to find my maps, or I can come down here. I'm going to find that position map. So if you baked your position map, you can see this color map that is essentially telling you which part of the scene, 3D scene, like left, right, up, down, forward, back, the surface is, that particular surface. And so what's cool is with this map, you can color correct or color select a part of your mesh and then color select another part of your mesh. And then it's going to create a gradient between those. So if I come out here and take a look at this, oh, I did it down there. So let's see, let's go back to that, this guy. So if I go like from here to here, and I come back and look at this, you'll see it did a gradient in that direction. And if I went to here to here and clicked on that, you can see I got a gradient that's going that direction. The transition point is right here, and then it's black and white on the other sides, and it has a slight direction. So anyways, that's what I did. I just did it towards the bottom. So I just color selected here and here. I have this mask editor, which I just found one that had some texture to it. I just kind of wanted to like subtract out some texture. You could do that. You could have just, I could have done, it looks like in this case, I probably didn't even need the 3D linear gradient, because I think the one thing with the 3D linear gradients, you can see this set to normal, is it didn't have any texture. What I could do is I could multiply like some kind of pattern on top of it, but it doesn't blend super well. So I ended up switching over to using a mask editor. So I just found one that actually I probably just right clicked in here and said add generator. And then we're going to go to mask editor. Okay, and then in here, what we're going to do is, this also has a 3D linear gradient built into it. So we're not going to use curvature. We are going to use position gradient. So you can see this looks kind of the same way. It just has different controls. So I come in here and I can play with the balance. It's definitely going to be top to bottom, right? So I have top to bottom on, and right to left, front to back is off. I can play a contrast. Let's go ahead and invert that. Let's play with the balance. So we're just bringing that down there. And the nice thing about this is you can blend in textures. So right now there's no texture input, but if you come down here, I can go ahead and find a texture. And so I just grabbed something that was like a little grungy, a little splotchy, something maybe like this. And then what you can do is come up to the texture, open that up. Let's set that to be triplanar. And then we can play with the scale. And then we can play with the contrast. And we can change the blending mode. So maybe we do like multiply and scale and contrast. So something like that. So it just has, this has a lot of features, and I can then blend in and start doing stuff with like ambient occlusion, or curvature. Let's say I wanted to add curvature. So we'll just take the curvature and we're going to do linear dodge add. If I did normal, it'll just override it. The linear dodge add, and let's just get the sharp edges. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull these in. So you can see I can now get those edges if I wanted to. But anyways, so this is just that lightning effect. We'll just turn that off and turn this one on. So that's just what I did. And then I just use clouds to break it up so it's a little less obvious. And this one's just got color. Maybe I'd add a little bit more roughness to it so it gets a little rougher down there. Okay, maybe it gets drier. Cool. So that's the big kind of color changes, and some features added. Next are going to be like hero marks and specific phenomenon, like this wood chipping, this hero mark down here, paint, and I'm going to add those next. All right, so next one I'm going to do is the hero mark. So what I do, this is what it looks like right here. So it looks like that. So the way this one works is, we're going to open this up. I put this in a folder. So if I have like one effect that's being controlled by like multiple layers, I'll often put them in a folder. When you do that, you want to set the blending modes for anything you have material information coming from to pass through. So if I set it to normal, even though these have blending modes, they're not interacting the way I want them to, right? They're like interacting strangely with the outside layers. Let's set this to here. So you can see this is set to multiply, but it's just using it as if this was normal, because it doesn't know that it's need to multiply outside of the folder. So if you set this to pass through, what it does is it does this blending mode outside too, right? So it just applies it to everything below it, because otherwise it doesn't have anything to blend against. And I did the same thing with my roughness. I set the folder to pass through, and height, I set it to pass through. And I do that on like all my folders. Cool. So what I did with this one is I started by making this shape here. So this is just a darker color. I add more roughness. I push in the heights right there. Just did a multiply for, or oops, set this to, oh yeah, base color is multiply. Okay. And then for the shape, what I did was I just came in here, dropped in a shape. I added it in the, let's see if I added it in the UV warp projection. So I just dropped in a fill layer, added a shape from the alpha. This is like a paintbrush mark. And then I switched to warp projection. So by default is UV. Then I did a warp projection. And then with warp projection, I can click on this button right here, surface tool, which lets me place it and it snaps to the surface. So I just moved it down there, scaled it down using these manipulator buttons up here and got it exactly where I wanted to in 3D. So this is what it looks like right there. Okay, so I wanted to add like this wider shape to it. I also kind of wanted to have it like start to kind of have a chipping effect into the grain. So what I did next was I just did a little painting and went a little bit wild. You can see I practically covered it. So what I did was I just grabbed a paintbrush. In this case, I was just using the default basic. So I just use basic. I turn off, if I'm using a mouse, I'm going to turn off all pin pressure stuff and use a low flow. So that means I can, when I scribble over the same mark, it's going to grow up. And so if we come back out here and look at this, so this one was done in conjunction with this levels node. So this levels node just like kind of clamped these. So if I draw this in, you can see I'm not going to get a lot of grayscale values. It's going to be pretty sharp. So using that levels node in there let me make sure I could paint this and keep it sharp instead of it just being fuzzy, and because otherwise you might be like, oh, this is a terrible approach, why am I doing it this way? This is just the way I like to do it. Is if I want to create like a cool custom shape with paintbrushes but it needs like a hard edge, what I do is just throw a levels node on there and just bring the input input max and min to get closer together, something like that. And the closer I bring it, the sharper it gets, right? So I left a little bit of fade to it so it can fade a little bit. And yeah, so now I can come in here and I can, you know, if I want to get rid of a part of the shape or add to the shape, I can just use this paintbrush and build it up. And if I use a lower flow, right, then it's going to build up a little bit more slowly. So if I go ahead and do that, then I can get this like sharper shape. Here we go. And come in here. And I use a lot of like this plus and minus kind of black and white. You know, I'll add black and then add white, then add black to kind of get these like tapered shapes. So if I come in here and if I wanted this to be a little bit sharper, just add that there. So now that's a little bit sharper. Cool. Added another one. So this one actually just has a texture map in it. So I just splotched on an alpha. So I just went over here, found like an alpha that I liked. So I just double clicked on it. You can do it this way, right? Where you double click on it and just, I'll set this to white. I'll set it to 100%. There you go. So I just stamped it on. Alternatively, what I could do is, let's set this back to basic hard, turn that off, bring this down. What I can do is I can do projection. So click on projection, we'll come down here, grab that alpha that I like. So I'll just grab that here. Holding S, you can get the hotkeys for manipulating the projection or the stencil. So this is like a stencil effect. You're like creating like a stencil you're spray painting through. So something like that. And then I can paint on like that. And so yeah, and that's how I did that. So let's Control Z that back. Oops. So press 1 to switch back to your normal paintbrush. 2 is eraser. So yeah, so I just added that little detail there for fun. Add a little blur because it was getting a little crunchy. So just a little bit of blur like that. I made sure I had an anchor point here because I'm going to reference this later. And then, of course, I have this levels node that's letting me kind of make it a little bit crispier and chunkier. So we're just going to kind of shrink this in a little bit. Okay, so that's pretty dramatic. I think this one's pretty soft, so I probably would soften it a little bit, but I'm just going to leave it like that for now. The next thing I did was I did this lightning effect. So I have this like edge lightning, so it made it pop a little bit better. So let's come here. I'm actually going to kind of like soften this shape a bit just so it feels a little bit more worn over time, right? So something like that maybe. it's too sharp and crispy, it's going to feel like it just happened. I want this to be worn down a little bit. So yeah, so this is just what I did on this one was I grabbed that anchor point and I loaded it in as a fill layer. So I just made that anchor point, created a fill layer in this one, and then selected that anchor point. And then what I did was I used levels to increase the contrast and invert it. So I just inverted it and increased the contrast, right? Then what I did was I did a high pass filter. So a high pass filter is just going to do an edge detection. So before I do that, it looks like this, and then this is going to highlight the edge so you can see that. Then you need to use a levels node to clamp it and move it down. So if we just do this, we go levels. I'll show you guys. So levels, and I just do this until I get the area I want. So I kind of want to just the outside edge. If I wanted the inside edge, what I could have done was done this. So I could have just inverted it and just changed that a bit. And so now the inside is being lit up. So we got that. Cool. Let's hide that one. Just do this one. And then, of course, I like to break it up a little bit. So I use a little blur slope. And on that blur slope, it's kind of subtle. It's not that big of a deal. But in here, you can see this is my shape. And then this is the interior, which I want to isolate. When I do that blur slope, that lightness spills into it. So what I did was I subtracted the shape back out. So this right here is exactly like this layer down here, right? It's just, I just took this and I duplicated and put it up here. And on this one, I just set its level. So I just came in like this and I wanted to subtract this back out of all this stuff. So, this is what I have here. I want to kind of recut the inside back out. So I don't have those little slopes going into it. So when I set this to subtract, we'll just go here, subtract. So it looks like that. And then I'm just going to play around with the contrast. And so we're just going to, there we go. So there we go. So now we got the blur slope, but it's not going to go into the interior shape. Okay. And then because I had like this extra edge lightning at the bottom, what I did, I just hand painted a little extra piece down there because I wanted that down there. And then the last thing I did was I added some wood grain to it. So I just kind of broke that shape up a bit and I got some grain going. So if we take a look at this, this layer is like lightening it. I could push the height back up a bit, but in this case, I put it a little bit further down. And this one, again, I was just using, in this case, I used anisotropic noise. I could have used directional scratches. And then I just masked out that shape again using an anchor point. So for this one, I just went to add fill. And grab my peel off mask. Not that one. Something I need. Ooh. Bottom hero mark. Sorry, my bad. I'm looking at the wrong one. Bottom hero mark mask. All right, and then I just set this to multiply. So that's going to take the dark values and multiply. And then I just increase the contrast to make sure it's sitting inside the mark itself. So something a little bit like that. And if I wanted to, I could probably add like a little bit of shadowing, right? So what I could do is we can do the same thing as this one. So we could just take this lighten, we're going to duplicate it. We're going to set this one, I'll put it up here to darken. So we're going to set this one to not worry about roughness. Let's just do a color multiply. So we're just going to do multiply. And on this one, what I'm going to do is we're going to come down here. We don't need this one. We can keep all these layers pretty much. So we're just do that high pass. We're doing this high pass. Instead of this levels, taking this high pass and grabbing the outside, we're going to actually grab the inside. So I need to invert it. And then what we're going to do, so if it looks like this, I'm going to invert it so the white's on the inside. And then I'm just going to contrast that down until I can get that. So there we go. So you can see it's just slightly darkening it. And I like doing that for some certain height details because it adds like a punch to it, right? So if I just had this without these, right, it gets kind of a little messy. And then I can just add that in there. And if it's too like edge detecty, right, like you can see the edge perfectly, Let's go ahead and do multiply on that one. And then we can blur slope it up a bit if we want to get an organic shape. But in this one, you can barely tell, so I'm not going to worry. I could add a fill layer with clouds to break it up, right? To give it a little bit more of an organic kind of breakup to it. But anyway, so that's the bottom mark. We're going to move on to this peel damage next. All right, so for the peel damage, the way I made this work is it's very similar to this one, where we're just kind of making this cutout mask, and then we're just referencing that shape with an anchor point to do some other effects. So we're just going to open up this peel mask here. It's a little crunchy right now, so I might undo some stuff, but we'll take a look at this. So we start with this right here. So what we're doing is we are taking just this fill layer. So I just have it like a lighter color because wherever it's exposed, it's lighter on the inside. I push the height down a little bit. In this case, pushing it probably a lot. I could probably reduce it a little bit. And then I'm making it rougher so that, the outside feels polished, but the inside feels raw and untreated. And then I just layered on a bunch of, or actually in this case, just 2 shapes, not too many. What I did was, here we go. I just went ahead and added this peeling paint material or alpha again. So I found one of those alphas I liked. I had some that are called peeling paint, which is perfect. Kind of feels the same as these chunky shapes. And then I subtracted it with another one. So I just grabbed a different one. So peeling paint 10, just set subtract so it wasn't everywhere. But I can keep those like cool graphic vertical shapes. They're both sets of cylindrical projection. And then come out here, look at this. It looks like that. Looks pretty good. I wanted this like hero mark. So what I did was I just, again, found like an alpha of like a shape that I liked, like something like this. And then I just put it on as projection and painted through it to get this like very specific mark that I wanted. And then I just set an anchor point. So now this is anchor pointed. So I just call this peel off. The base color is lightening it. Roughness should just be set to normal because we don't want it to mix with the outside layer, right? Because this is completely new material or surface underneath, right? It shouldn't be mixing with this layer out here. Something to keep in mind is you should be naming your layers and grouping them as you're going along based on, and in my case, I color code them. I like color code like completely different like material interactions or big surface changes. So I usually do those as orange. Sometimes if I don't have things in a group, I don't want to put them in a group, I just pair them, but they're paired up together. I give them a color that shares together. So these crack and crack edge, they're like influencing each other. And then I name them something that makes sense. So just make sure you're doing that. Okay, another thing to keep in mind is for my fill layers, I'm only doing very specific material attributes. My base material, I want to have everything. So in this case, I should probably have normal on. Well, in this case, my normal I want it on, but set 0. But at the very bottom, you do want, so I might do something like this, add a fill layer at the very bottom, and just have all of your material attributes on. So it really isn't affecting anything, right? Because all my layers are on top. But if you ever have like a material attribute where you have like, let's say you add on a height information or metal information. Let's say we take a look at the metalness channel, right? So metalness channel, if I didn't have this layer and I didn't have, in this layer I wasn't using metalness, you see this has alpha transparency. And so even if I did want to turn off the metalness on this layer, if I put this fill layer down here and had metalness on and just had a default value, that way, when I export my textures, I'm not going to have transparency, right, on my texture map. Because if this doesn't have metal and this doesn't have metal and nothing else has, and something only has a little bit of metal, then you'll have a little bit of information than other areas where you just have transparent or alpha textures. And if you know what you're doing, that's not a big deal, but sometimes that can trip you up or cause problems. So my recommendation is just have a fill layer at the very, very bottom. Sometimes I just call it base, and then just make sure I have all of my material attributes on, just to prevent when I export my textures, like partially transparent textures. Okay. So let's come back up to this peel. All right, so on this peel texture, we got that. So the next thing I did was I added a little bit of grain. I did the same thing as I did down here. So I just grabbed this mask, brought it in as an anchor point. So we just did this, brought this in as an anchor point, or anchor point as a fill layer. I did bevel to kind of shrink it in a little bit, and then use directional scratches as multiply to get that texture. So I just had this darken a little bit, push in a little bit more in the height, change the roughness up just slightly, And yeah, that's what I did. Bevel is just going to shrink or grow the shape. So if I come in here, you can see it looks like this. It's a little bit like Blur, but it doesn't have a soft fall off. It has like a kind of ramped fall off. It's kind of hard to see on these, but it essentially gives you like a slope. I didn't really need to use it, but I just did it anyways. And so then I added that directional scratches. I could just do the directional scratches and not on the bevel itself, or not use the bevel at all. But by doing this, I kind of kept it a little bit away from the edges. So you can see it's kind of pushed away from the edges a little bit and not right on the edges. And that's the main reason why I did it, but that's just personal preference. Okay. Next thing I did was a little bit of edge lift. This is a layer I'm not super happy with, but I kept it in here just to show it. So the edge lifts, and let's go ahead and I probably just need to desat and darken this a bit. Maybe not that's desaturated. This is very desaturated. There we go. So the base color is screening, so it's just lightening it up a bit. I also am pushing up on the height, so it just pushed up. So it's not going to be that great because this whole surface gets really crunchy. So I want to get rid of like these little splotches, so I'd have to clean that up. But the nice thing it does is you can get this effect to make it feel like it's lifting off the surface. In this case, I don't really need it though, because I don't have like this peeling, flaking effect, right? Those chips feel like they were worn off, chipped off, and then the edges were worn down. So I kept this on here, but just with like you can do it in the reverse, which is kind of interesting. It almost kind of feels like it pushed in. So it's cool because you can do this and give a lip to things, but I'll just give a little bit of height. But all this one is kind of, it's the same idea as let's get rid of everything I'm not using. So I'll get rid of that. So I'm just doing my fill layer, using a high pass to do an edge detect, use a levels to isolate the outer edges. I used a fill of the peel off mask just so I can, and set it to subtract, just so I can get rid of the stuff that's inside, try to get rid of that. And then use clouds so it's not everywhere. So it's kind of lost and found. And then just like the hero mark, I just did a little darkening, and that's, we're not going to go into that one, but it's going to be the same idea, but it's going to be on the inside instead of the outside. Okay. And so that's my peel damage, my kind of flaking, scratching, chunk kind of removal that shows raw wood underneath. Okay, moving on. I noticed on this one, this has a very big distinct crack on it. So I added a crack here, so you can see it right there. I'm going to hide the peel damage just so we can see this a little bit better. So here's the crack. So up close, it looks a little jank, but from far away, I think it holds up pretty well. So I'm not going to get this close up, so I'm okay with it. But what I did on this one is we're going to take a look at this. So what I did was I just used this paintbrush. So I just found a paintbrush that, and it had like a little bit of a jagged edge to it. I blurred it and then beveled it so that I can get this kind of like sharp, thin line that's fairly consistent, right? So I just use blur to soften it, and then bevel to kind of like shrink this in, and then use levels to sharpen it off. So just use levels to kind of, clamp the values, which gives me a sharper shape. So something like that. And we'll just look at this. And so then, I'll play around with that shape here to get the shape I want, something like that. Okay. The cool thing about setting something like that up, I can come in here, and again, I can just use a basic brush with black and white. So black is going to shrink it, white's going to grow it, right? And you can see you can get some pretty cool shapes and stuff on there, depending on how you've set it up. That's a cool effect. It's not what I'm going for, but that's actually pretty awesome. But that would be cool if I was doing like maybe peeling paint or something like that, or metal. But cool. So that was that. And then I just did a little bit of lightening again on the edges so that they pop a bit. So I just grabbed this crack with an anchor point, brought it into this layer, did a high pass, inverted it, played with the levels a bit to spread it, got some lost and found so it's not so consistent, and that just adds like a nice little dimensionality to it. Okay. Then what I did next was I just added a little bit more breakup to my roughness. It felt like it was like a little flat still. So I kind of wanted a little bit of grime breakup. So I just added this just really subtle but if we take a look at the roughness, just added a little bit more breakup to it, a little bit more texture. Right there. Something that's pretty good to do is to add a little bit of grit. So first, let's take a look at this. So all I really did was just did something that was grungy and broke it up, and just gave it like set it to screen. So it'll lighten. So if I go to roughness, screen, it's gonna lighten, and just kind of dialed in a little bit of additional roughness. So I just got an angle like this and just kind of pulled it in until I can see that grime a little bit. Something you can do is you can add a little bit of extra noise to your surface. It might not be appropriate here, but what I could do is we're going to take a duplication of this. So we duplicate layer. I'm not sure if this is a good idea, but I'm going to do it because I think it's worth showing you guys. So we're going to maybe add a little bit of gloss to it. So what I'm going to do for this one is I'm going to go ahead and add in, let's see, we're going to use one of the 3D noises. So I'll do 3D Perlin Noise Fractal. Just leave it as its default. I'm going to bring the min level and max level close together. And what that does is just makes it very hard. There we go. Let's see if we can play around with this to see if this will help a little bit. Nope, that's not changing much. We'll just keep it a high quality. And then what I can do is I can do a little contrast, and then I can do position. So we can do something like that. And then what I can do is duplicate this effect, linear dodge add. And then what I'm gonna do is just change the seed a little bit. And let's change the scale slightly. And then well, let's make it bigger. Let's do something bigger. And then I can maybe make this a little less frequent. Let's go ahead and duplicate that again. Screen, linear dodge add or screen, whichever one you want to do. I'm just going to go ahead and that one I'll seed. We'll just change the shape a little bit. And it's pretty subtle, but you can kind of see it right there. It's just breaking that up just a little bit. So sometimes I do that in the color, sometimes I do that in height, sometimes I do that in roughness or both. Yeah, so if we take a look at this, you can see it's starting to kind of show up a little bit better. So that just adds a little additional texture to your surface sometimes, that like really fine texture. You need to be careful because back here you can see like my overall surface is actually getting glossier. But you know, that can also add just, maybe we'll do color. We'll set this to screen. Here, let's see what overlay does. And then just dial that down really low. Okay, and then, so, you know, doing something like that can give just a little bit of texture. Maybe we'll just play around with height just slightly. So this is giving like a little porous look. Maybe it's just a little too much. So let's see, 0.01. And maybe let's get rid of the color for a second. There we go. I actually kind of like that better. That just gives a little bit, and that'll help with like if we ever get closer to my surface. You know, from back here you really can't tell, but when I get up close, that'll really help with just a little bit of extra texture and believability. And I could do that with like pushing the surface up as well. Cool. All right, so the other thing I did at this point was I added a little bit more polish here because it felt a little too rough. So I just kind of just made this a little bit glossier, maybe too much. So I might come in here to this layer and, oh, and I also removed the height a bit. So you can see the height kind of smoothed down. And what I'm doing for the height, so I'll show you. So the height's set to 0, so that's just its neutral state. We go over to the height. Normally the height's set to linear dodge add, which means that it just interacts and adds to the layer below. But if you set it to normal, it's going to behave like a normal layer where it's just going to override the information. And then what I could do is I can just dial the opacity down. And this can give you like an effect of like, if you have a crunchy surface, it can help you like polish the surface off a bit. So something like that. And then I just used roughness to multiply, which is going to darken it, which is going to polish it. So then, you know, we just took this and just started polishing a little bit. And then I just set normal. In this case, it doesn't really do anything, but if I, again, with the normals, Normals are also set to do normal multiply detail, I think, or normal detail. And so it's going to be like linear dodge add, where it's going to combine the layers normal information. So if I set it to just normal instead of normal map combiner detail, then it's going to overlay the normal information. But I'm pretty sure I don't have any normal information. So, oh, that's not true. There's some residual stuff from a different layer that I probably need to fix. But yeah, so that should just cover it for the most part. So that was like my handle polishing effect. Just kind of polishing that area down. And then next step is going to be, well, I'll show the next one and then we'll come back to the paint, is I added a little bit of like a contact information here. I got this from a different layer. So this one right here has this like kind of grime buildup. So I could do something a little bit more sophisticated or interesting, but this one's just a single layer I added. And so this is kind of like what I did at the bottom with the bottom lightning, and I just did that up here, where in this case, actually, I just painted it. I just used like a little texture map, just use a paintbrush and just put it in, and used levels so it looked like that, and then I just used levels to kind of get the shape I wanted, so I just kind of pulled that in a little bit. So that was just to help give a little contact and like information between the head and the handle, which is, I think, make them integrate a little bit better. Okay, next we're going to take a look at the paint. All right, so for the paint information, I started with doing, so we have a lot of different paint stuff, and so I have this paint folder, so this is a whole materials folder, but we'll start with this paint flex. So I just got this kind of base color, I added slight height, and similarly I might want to set the height to normal, but we'll see. Roughness, I set it to okay roughness. And then and just left all the other attributes on. It didn't really matter in this case. I'll turn that on. So I just got this kind of like overall like speckly kind of, I called it flex. But just coming in here, it's just, I'm just layering up dirt nodes. And so they're kind of hard to see, but you can see it looks like this. So I'm just using dirt 2, which has like an irregular pattern to it. And all I'm doing is doing linear dodge add, and then just changing the scale and doing a randomized seed, and I'm just layering them up. And so again, I'm coming out here and I'm just sort of seeing what looks good, and I'm using different blending modes. They're not all 100. If they're all 100 and all look the same, then this tends to look pretty flat. I could use like a fill layer, or sorry, a clouds fill layer to multiply it down. But since I'm building these up in multiple layers, just by doing different blending modes, I'm kind of getting a more natural lost and found here. So that's my paint flex. All right, so now the main material, the paint material. So this one right here, I'm going to toggle this mask off. So toggle mask. And so this one right here is just, I have a couple of layers. So we have this base paint layer. So again, I could set the height to normal to kind of get rid of the layers below. I didn't on this one. And I just added some color breakup like I did at the bottom of my layer stack. So I got some warm, or like this kind of, I was just looking at here, I was color sampling, right? I took the chosen one as this like kind of brownish, yellowish, tan paint color, and just did a little breakup for darker colors, a little bit of blue, a little bit of warm browns. Everything's pretty standard. Just playing around with these different patterns. And then what I did was, we'll just go ahead and toggle mask. And then I just layered all this information. I'm not happy with this paint splotches layer, so I would keep playing around with this one, but it's literally just, I'm just adding on all these different texture maps to kind of get the effect I want. And then anchor pointing it, of course. Oh, one thing I did want to note is I did subtract out my peel paint shape. So I just brought my peel paint shape, peel off mask in here, and set it to subtract so that I can make it so it doesn't go in there. And I did the same thing with the cracks, because that kind of like, when it bridged over the cracks, it kind of made it look like the crack wasn't there. So I just subtracted those out. Okay. And then this is a really subtle effect, but I did add a little height to the paint. So if I come here, this one's barely coming on. Oh, there you go. You can see it. I had a bigger paint splash, so it made more sense when I had big paint splashes, but with these small ones, since they're less dense, I guess it's not as obvious, but you can see them here. So I'm just using that blur node, and we can just pull that in a little bit. So, I can do that, and then that's just giving a little bit of dimensionality to the paint. And then this one right here was just to subtract out some grain again, just to give a grain effect. Cool. The next thing I did was I accentuated the color. So one thing I like to do is do gradients. So gradients are really nice for drawing attention to key areas. Some of them are caused by wear and use, right? So you might have a gradient where if this was like a leg of a table, it might be darker at the base because of like moisture and its contact with the ground, and it might be more worn up here because maybe your knees are hitting it. And so, but gradients are also like an artistic decision. So I might do something like, I'll show you what that could look like. So we're gonna take this, I'm gonna just convert this mask to black. I'm gonna set this just to color, just so we can see this. And then we can do that 3D linear gradient. So 3D, let's turn that off. Linear gradient. So that's the mask. And so it usually looks something a bit like this. So we'll set this to multiply. And so I might do something like invert, dial this down a little bit. But by doing something like this, you can draw attention up here, right? If I look at this from far away, right, this is all pretty uniform. But if I do that, then this loses a little bit of focus and draws up here a little bit. So I did that philosophy, but I did it in a different way. So I still have this gradient. I did it kind of in the middle of the handle. And so in this one, I did it with a pass-through layer. So this pass-through layer, I call them adjustment layers. But what you do is you add a paint layer. The reason why I add a paint layer is this layer, I don't want to put information in it. So fill layer, I could do fill layer and just turn off all the layers or all the channels, but I just do a paint layer because it's empty. And then we set it to pass through. So pass through means that it's going to interact with all the layers below in that channel. So in this case, it's color affecting the color channel. If I added a sharpen, so if we come down here and added sharpen, like that, it's going to sharpen all my color information, right? You can see it says roughness as well, but it's not changing anything. But that's because my roughness isn't set to pass through. So if I set this to pass through, take a look at the roughness. So if we bring up that sharpen intensity, you can see it affecting the roughness now. But if I didn't have pass through on it, this wouldn't affect the roughness at all. So that's pretty much what we're doing. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a levels node. So what I'm doing is I was just adding a little bit of like a punch, just a slight punch. Might need to desat it a little bit, but let's see. So we just look at that. Yeah, let's push it a little higher contrast, and I might do an HSL filter. So we'll add filter HSL, because when you increase contrast, you're going to increase color saturation, which actually in this case isn't that bad, but I might just drop the saturation just a little bit. So just something like that. Just turn that on and off. So it just adds a little bit of contrast punch. And then what I did was I just used the gradient effect. So we can just add this here and I'll show you what it looks like. And then invert. So you can see here, the top area is getting a little bit more of a punch and the bottom area is not being affected. But I did it a little bit more selectively, where I wanted the middle of the handle, this area, to be the attention grabbing area. So the last thing I had up here was an overall adjustment. So this one is, I need to tweak it, but what we did again, I did just set these to a paint layer with pass through. And so we just sharpened the roughness a bit. I also did a little bit more contrast in the roughness too. It just adds a little bit of contrast. If we take a look at this like that, just adding that and making some tweaks. We take a look at the roughness. So just adjusting the values a little bit, sharpening the details a little bit. For the color, I was doing this earlier. I was just kind of playing around with it, but I was doing a high pass filter. So as we know, a high pass filter from earlier is an edge detection. So high pass is kind of cool because what it does is it will accentuate edges, and it's actually what is the basis of the sharpening filter if you do a sharpen. So I was just playing around with doing a high pass filter because I felt like it gave me just a little bit more control. But yeah, so I can just do that. The only problem is the white values got really, really bright, so I probably have to like adjust the levels. So I came in here, just grab this, and maybe we can bring the white values down a little bit. And we'll just kind of tweak the values just a bit. So yeah, so that just added some sharpness. Maybe I'd probably dial back the paint in this case, but that's just like a final effect I do at the end. Those can be really expensive, so just be careful of doing those adjustment filters at the very top. If your computer is going really slow, I would disable those while you're working and then just put them on at the end. So filters, they're when you do these pass-throughs and when you just do filters in general, everything that's affected by it. So if it's in a mask, all the mask layers, or if it's an adjustment layer like this with pass through, it's going to affect everything below it. It's going to take all that information and then tweak it, right? So that's going to be really expensive. So anyways, this is the end of the wood tutorial. I had another one that I did here, which is just a slightly different version, more closer to this. And so it's following all the same kind of concepts, but just going for color. But if you have access to this file from my class, so you can just download this and open it up. And there's one other feature I have in here, which is peeling a paint effect. So if you wanted like thick paint on top, or rubber or something like that that was worn away and torn away, like it's a separate layer coating that's thick like that, I have like a layer that I did for that. So yeah, hopefully this helps.